She's not dead. 3 words, shouted across a windswept cemetery by a man in rags, and the funeral of billionaire CEO Evelyn Hart explodes into chaos. Security rushes forward. Phones snap up. Her husband, Grant Hart, goes rigid with fury. Because the homeless man kneeling beside the open casket isn't confused or drunk, he's absolutely certain. And when he pulls a small vial from his coat and says there's still time to save her, the crowd realizes something far worse than death might be unfolding here. If you want to see how far this story reaches, drop a comment with your city below. Now let me take you back to where it all began and show you exactly how a woman came back from her own grave. The wind off the Atlantic was merciless that October morning, cutting through the black coats and veils gathered at Rosewood Memorial Cemetery like a blade through silk. The sky hung low and gray, pregnant with rain that refused to fall, as if even the weather knew something was wrong. Evelyn Hart's casket gleamed under the canvas pavilion, mahogany and brass, obscenely expensive, befitting a woman whose net worth had once been calculated in billions. The mourners stood in careful formation, board members in the front row, their expressions professionally somber, business rivals 3 rows back, their grief tinged with poorly concealed relief. And at the very edge of the gathering, a cluster of household staff who'd worked in the Hart mansion, their tears the only ones that looked genuine. Grant Hart stood closest to the casket, one hand resting on the polished wood with practiced tenderness. At 42, he cut an impressive figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver threading through his dark hair in exactly the right places to suggest distinction rather than age. His charcoal suit was impeccable. His tie was knotted with military precision, and his eyes, red-rimmed behind designer frames, swept across the crowd with something that looked almost like satisfaction. "We are gathered here," the minister began, his voice fighting against the wind, "to celebrate the life of Evelyn Marie Hart, beloved wife, visionary leader, and..." That's when the shouting started. "Stop! Stop the burial!" Heads turned as one. A figure was running up the cemetery path, stumbling over the manicured grass in boots held together with duct tape. His coat was 3 sizes too large, probably pulled from a donation bin. His beard was wild and gray-streaked. His eyes burned with an intensity that made several mourners step back instinctively. Caleb Raines had spent 14 months living under bridges and in shelters, but his voice still carried the command of a man who'd once led engineering teams and signed million-dollar contracts. He pushed through the outer ring of mourners like they were made of smoke. "She's not dead!" he shouted, pointing at the casket. "Evelyn Hart is not dead!" Grant's hand left the casket. His jaw tightened. "Security! Now!" 2 men in dark suits moved to intercept, but Caleb was already halfway to the front, his momentum carrying him past the shocked minister and directly to the pavilion's edge. Up close, the assembled crowd could see the desperation etched into every line of his face, but also something else. Certainty. Absolute, unshakable certainty. "Sir, you need to leave," one of the security guards said, reaching for Caleb's arm. Caleb jerked away. "Touch me and you'll be accessories to murder." The word landed like a grenade. Several people gasped. Grant's face flushed dark red. "How dare you?" Grant hissed, stepping forward. "How dare you come here on the worst day of my life and the worst day of your life?" Caleb's laugh was sharp and bitter. "The worst day of your life. Your wife is in that box, Grant, and she's still breathing." "That's insane," one of the board members muttered. "Is it?" Caleb spun to face the crowd, his arms spread wide. "Then explain to me why she's being buried less than 24 hours after being pronounced dead. Explain why there was no autopsy. Explain why..." He jabbed a finger toward a man standing slightly apart from the family group. Dr. Nolan Pierce signed a death certificate without running a single test. All eyes turned to the doctor. Nolan Pierce was in his late 50s, with the kind of face that inspired trust. Gentle features, warm eyes, the silver hair of a man you'd want holding your hand in an emergency room. But right now, those warm eyes were fixed on the ground, and his hands were trembling. "Doctor!" Pierce examined her thoroughly, Grant said, his voice tight. "She had a massive stroke. Her heart stopped. She was gone before the ambulance even arrived." "Then you won't mind if I check," Caleb said quietly. He moved toward the casket. Grant blocked his path, and for a moment the two men stood face to face, the grieving billionaire husband in his $1,000 suit and the homeless man who smelled of rain and desperation. The security guards hovered, uncertain. "You're not touching my wife," Grant said, each word sharp as glass. Caleb didn't blink. "If she's dead like you say, then I can't hurt her. But if she's not, if she's in there, paralyzed, terrified, unable to move or speak while you bury her alive, then every second we waste is torture." A woman in the third row made a small, horrified sound. Grant's eyes narrowed. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" "My name is Caleb Rains," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I used to be somebody, software engineer, six-figure salary, house in the suburbs. Then my company went under, my wife left, and I lost everything. For the past year, I've been living on the streets." He paused, letting that sink in. "2 nights ago, I was sleeping under the Riverside Bridge when I heard 2 men talking. They thought they were alone. They weren't." The crowd was silent now, transfixed. "One of them," Caleb continued, pointing at Grant, "was you, and the other was Dr. Pierce, and you were discussing how to make a murder look like natural causes." The minister took an involuntary step backward. Several mourners pulled out their phones, suddenly aware they might be witnessing something far beyond a funeral. Grant's face had gone from red to white. "That's a lie. You're a mentally ill vagrant making up stories for attention." "Am I?" Caleb reached into his coat, slowly, carefully, aware of the security guards' hands moving to their belts, and pulled out a small glass vial, no larger than his thumb. The liquid inside was clear as water. "This is the neutralizer, the antidote to the compound Dr. Pierce used on her." Dr. Pierce made a choking sound. Grant didn't move, but something flickered behind his eyes. Calculation. Fear. "You're talking nonsense," Grant said, but his voice had lost its edge. Caleb held up the vial, letting the weak sunlight catch it. "The drug is called tetrodotoxin, TTX for short. It's a neurotoxin found in certain fish, but synthesized versions exist in very specific labs. When administered correctly, it mimics death almost perfectly. Breathing becomes undetectable. Body temperature drops. The heart rate slows to less than 10 beats per minute. Even experienced doctors can be fooled." He looked directly at Dr. Pierce, especially if they're paid not to look too closely. The doctor's face had gone gray. His lips moved soundlessly. One of the board members, a woman named Catherine Reeves, who'd sat across from Evelyn in 100 meetings, stepped forward. "If what you're saying is true, we need to open the casket, now." "No," Grant said sharply. "This is desecration. This is a woman's life," Catherine interrupted. She turned to the minister. "Open it." The minister looked to Grant. Grant looked to his security team. The security team looked at the 200 phones now recording every moment. Nobody moved. Caleb took the decision out of their hands. He stepped around Grant, who was too shocked to react, and reached for the casket's edge. The lid wasn't locked yet. The ceremony had barely begun. His fingers found the seal and pushed. The mahogany lid rose with a whisper of hinges. Evelyn Hart lay inside on white satin, her hands folded across her chest, her face painted with the waxy stillness of death. She was 51 years old but looked younger. Her skin unlined, her dark hair swept back from her forehead, her lips the faint pink of cosmetics applied by careful funeral home hands. She wore a navy dress, simple and elegant, with her wedding ring catching the light. She looked perfectly, utterly dead. The crowd pressed closer. Caleb heard someone crying. He ignored them all, leaning over the casket with the focus of a surgeon. His fingers went to Evelyn's neck, searching for a pulse. "Stop this," Grant said, but he didn't move to interfere. He stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides. Caleb found nothing, no heartbeat, no warmth. He moved his hand to her mouth, feeling for breath. Still nothing. But he wasn't looking for the obvious signs. He was looking for micro-movements, the kind that happened when someone was in a state so close to death that only the most sophisticated equipment could distinguish life from its absence. He lifted her eyelid. The pupil was dilated, unresponsive. He pressed gently on her sternum, feeling for the tiniest expansion of lungs. And there, so faint it might have been imagination, he felt it. A flutter, a whisper of movement. "She's alive," he breathed. "Bullshit," someone in the crowd said. Caleb ignored them. He tilted Evelyn's head back, checking her airway, And that's when he saw it. Two small pieces of cotton, barely visible, inserted into her nostrils. Standard funeral practice, used to prevent fluids from leaking, but also the perfect way to ensure someone in a death-like state couldn't get enough oxygen to recover on their own. He pulled the cotton out with shaking fingers. "What are you doing?" Grant's voice had risen to a shout. "You're defiling her body!" "I'm saving her life," Caleb said. He uncapped the vial with his teeth and tilted Evelyn's head further back, exposing the pale column of her throat. Her lips were slightly parted. He brought the vial to her mouth and let a single drop fall onto her tongue. Nothing happened. The crowd held its collective breath. Caleb counted seconds in his head. 10, 15, 20. Still nothing. Doubt began to creep in. Had he been wrong? Had the voices under the bridge been talking about someone else, some other scheme? Had he just assaulted a corpse in front of 200 witnesses? He prepared a second drop. "Enough!" Grant lunged forward, shoving Caleb aside. Something metallic flashed in his hand. A syringe, the barrel filled with cloudy liquid. "You've done enough damage, you crazy—" Evelyn coughed. It was small, barely audible, but in the sudden silence of the cemetery, it sounded like a thunderclap. Her chest rose, a shallow, desperate inhale. Her fingers twitched against the satin. Someone screamed. Grant froze, the syringe still raised. For one crystalline moment, everyone could see exactly what he'd been about to do. Inject his dead wife with something that would make her death permanent and irreversible. Evelyn's eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused, glassy, but they found Grant's face. Her lips moved, forming a single word with agonizing slowness. "Why?" The syringe fell from Grant's hand and shattered on the stone pathway. The cloudy liquid spread across the ground like poison. That's when the security guards moved, not to protect Grant, but to restrain him. They grabbed his arms as he stood there, statue still, the color draining from his face. Dr. Pierce bolted, making it maybe 10 feet before 3 mourners tackled him to the grass. Catherine Reeves was already on her phone. "I need an ambulance at Rosewood Memorial Cemetery. We have a woman who was almost buried alive." "Yes, you heard me correctly. Alive." Caleb knelt beside the casket, supporting Evelyn's head as she struggled to breathe. Her hand found his, cold, weak, but undeniably alive, and squeezed. "You're safe," he whispered. "I've got you." Her eyes met his, and in them he saw confusion, terror, betrayal, and the dawning awareness that she'd been seconds away from a death more horrible than anything she could have imagined. Buried alive, unable to scream, unable to move while dirt rained down on mahogany and darkness closed in forever. A single tear tracked down her cheek. Grant was shouting now, his composure shattered. "This is insane! She was dead! I saw her die! This man is drugging her! He's doing something to her!" "Shut up," Catherine said coldly. "Just shut up, Grant." The sirens were growing louder. Evelyn's breathing was strengthening, each inhale coming easier than the last as the antidote worked through her system. Caleb kept his hand on her shoulder, anchoring her to reality, to life, to the world she'd almost left behind. The crowd had transformed from mourners to witnesses. Phones were everywhere now, capturing every moment. Evelyn's awakening, Grant's arrest, Dr. Pierce's desperate struggles as the mourners turned captors held him down. This was going to be everywhere within the hour. Social media, news sites, the kind of story that would dominate headlines for weeks. The ambulance arrived, paramedics rushing forward with a gurney. Caleb stepped back, letting them work, watching as they checked Evelyn's vitals, and began the process of reversing what Grant and Dr. Pierce had done to her. "Blood pressure's low but rising," one paramedic called out. "Pupils responding to light. She's coming around." "Sir," another paramedic said to Caleb. "What did you give her?" "Flumazenil, Caleb said, "mixed with epinephrine. It's an antagonist to tetrodotoxin, reverses the paralysis, and stimulates the central nervous system." The paramedic stared at him, at his ragged coat, his wild beard, his homeless appearance. "How the hell do you know that?" "Because I used to design pharmaceutical tracking software," Caleb said quietly, "before I lost everything." They loaded Evelyn onto the gurney. She was more alert now, her eyes tracking movement, her fingers gripping the paramedic's hand. As they wheeled her past Grant, who stood between 2 security guards, his face a mask of barely controlled rage, she turned her head to look at him. Whatever she saw there made her close her eyes and turn away. Police cars were pulling up now, their lights painting the cemetery in red and blue. Officers emerged, taking statements, securing the scene, collecting the shattered syringe and its damning contents. Dr. Pierce was already in handcuffs, sitting on the ground with his head in his hands. Grant was next, the officers reading him his rights, while Catherine Reeves stood nearby, her phone pressed to her ear, already calling emergency board meetings and crisis management teams. A detective approached Caleb. "I'm going to need you to come down to the station. We have a lot of questions." "I know," Caleb said. He watched the ambulance pull away, taking Evelyn toward a hospital instead of the grave that had been waiting for her. "I'll tell you everything." The cemetery was chaos now, mourners clustering in groups, sharing what they'd seen, the story already mutating and growing. But Caleb stood apart, suddenly exhausted, the adrenaline draining away and leaving him hollow. He'd done it. He'd saved her. But the cost of that knowledge, of what he'd overheard, of what he'd almost been too late to stop, sat heavy in his chest. Under the Riverside Bridge 2 nights ago, he'd been trying to sleep when the voices drifted down from above. 2 men, their words carrying on the wind. He'd heard them planning everything, the drug, the dosage, the timing, the quick burial before anyone could ask too many questions. He'd heard Grant describe how he'd inject Evelyn with something that would mimic a stroke, how Dr. Pierce would sign off without an autopsy, how they'd have her in the ground before her assistant, or the board could insist on a second opinion. And he'd heard why. Grant Hart was broke. Not cut back on luxuries broke. Utterly, catastrophically insolvent. He'd made bad investments, worse bets, and loans to people who'd disappeared. Evelyn's fortune was in a trust he couldn't touch while she lived, but upon her death, it all came to him. $3 billion. More than enough to cover his debts and leave him wealthy beyond measure. All it would cost was his wife's life. Caleb had spent that entire night deciding what to do. He was a homeless man with a history of mental health struggles following his breakdown. Who would believe him? Who would listen? But the alternative, doing nothing, letting Evelyn Hart be murdered, was impossible. So he tracked down an old colleague, someone from his pharmaceutical software days who still remembered when Caleb had been brilliant instead of broken. He'd explained what he needed. The colleague had thought he was crazy but had helped anyway, synthesizing a small batch of the antidote using chemistry knowledge and access to a university lab. Caleb had spent his last $40 on a bus ticket to get here. He'd arrived at the cemetery gates just as the funeral was beginning and had run the rest of the way. "Mr. Rains?" The detective was waiting. "Ready?" Caleb nodded. As they walked toward the police car, he looked back at the grave, at the hole in the ground that would have become Evelyn's tomb. It was still open, still waiting, but it would wait forever now. The clouds finally broke, rain began to fall, soft and steady, washing the cemetery clean. And in a hospital 15 minutes away, Evelyn Hart took her first fully conscious breath in 2 days and began to remember exactly what her husband had done. The truth was coming, justice was coming, and nothing, not money, not power, not Grant Hart's carefully constructed lies, was going to stop it. The rain had turned into a steady downpour by the time Caleb sat down in the interrogation room at the precinct. Water dripped from his coat onto the linoleum floor, forming a small puddle around his chair. Detective Maria Santos sat across from him, a recording device between them, her dark eyes sharp with the kind of skepticism that came from 20 years of hearing lies. "Let me get this straight," she said, clicking her pen rhythmically. "You're homeless, you haven't held a job in over a year, and you expect me to believe you just happened to overhear a murder plot while sleeping under a bridge." "I don't expect you to believe anything," Caleb said quietly. "I expect you to investigate. Test the syringe Grant was holding. Test Evelyn's blood. The science doesn't lie, Detective. I do." Santos stopped clicking her pen. "You're admitting you lied?" "I'm admitting I'm not reliable," Caleb said. "I had a breakdown 3 years ago. Severe depression, anxiety, the whole package. Lost my job, lost my family, lost my mind for a while. So no, I'm not a credible witness by any traditional measure. But that doesn't make what I heard any less true." The detective studied him for a long moment. Outside the interrogation room, Caleb could hear phones ringing, voices raised, the chaos of a police station dealing with a case that had already gone viral. Through the small window in the door, he caught glimpses of officers rushing past, reporters being turned away at the entrance, the machinery of justice grinding into motion. "Walk me through it," Santos said finally. "Everything you heard under that bridge." Caleb closed his eyes, pulling up the memory. It was around 11 at night, October 18th. I'd found a spot under the Riverside Bridge where the wind doesn't hit as hard. There's a drainage pipe there, dry this time of year, where I keep a sleeping bag. I was just settling in when I heard footsteps above me on the bridge. 2 men, walking slow, talking low. But sound carries weird under there. It echoes. I could hear every word. "And you recognize the voices?" "Not at first. One of them said Grant, and the other one said Dr. Pierce, so I knew their names. But I didn't know who they were until later." Caleb opened his eyes. The first voice, Grant's, said tomorrow night. "We do it tomorrow night when she gets home from the charity gala." And the doctor asked if he was absolutely sure because there was no going back after this. Santos was writing now, her hand moving quickly across her notepad. "Go on." Grant said he was sure. Said he'd been sure for months, but he needed time to set everything up. The life insurance policies, the trust documents, making sure everything would transfer to him without complications. He said Evelyn had gotten suspicious lately, asking questions about their finances, threatening to bring in an outside auditor. Caleb's hands clenched on the table. He said she was getting too close to the truth, and he couldn't risk her finding out about the debts. What debts? He didn't specify amounts, just said he'd made investments that went bad, borrowed from people who don't accept sorry as payment. Said if Evelyn found out, she'd divorce him, and the prenup would leave him with nothing. But if she died... Caleb trailed off. If she died, he'd inherit everything, Santos finished. $3 billion, according to what I heard. Enough to pay off his debts and still live like a king. Caleb leaned forward. Then Dr. Pierce asked about the method, and that's when they got into the details. The doctor said he had access to a synthetic tetrodotoxin, TTX, from a research project he'd consulted on years ago. Said it would mimic a massive stroke perfectly, drop her heart rate to almost nothing, lower her body temperature, make her appear dead to anyone who didn't run specific toxicology tests. Santos's pen paused. And he was confident it would work? He said he'd done it before. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Santos's eyes widened fractionally. He said what? He said he'd done it before, Caleb repeated. Those exact words. I've done this before, Grant. I know what I'm doing. And Grant asked if anyone had ever found out, and the doctor laughed and said, You don't find what you're not looking for. Santos stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Wait here. She left the room, and through the window, Caleb watched her grab another detective, saw them talking in urgent animated gestures. Within minutes, the second detective was on the phone, and Santos was back with a laptop. Dr. Nolan Pierce has been Evelyn Hart's personal physician for 7 years, she said, typing rapidly. Before that, he was on staff at 3 different hospitals. I'm pulling records now of any suspicious deaths he might have been involved with. She looked up at Caleb. If what you're saying is true, if he's done this before, we could be looking at a serial killer with a medical license. The words hung in the air like smoke. Caleb felt suddenly cold despite the stale warmth of the interrogation room. He'd saved Evelyn, yes, but how many others had there been? How many people had Dr. Pierce declared dead who'd actually been paralyzed, aware, terrified as they were zipped into body bags or slid into morgue drawers or, God help them, buried alive? What happened next under the bridge? Santos asked, her voice gentler now. After he said he'd done it before? They discussed timing, Caleb said. Dr. Pierce said he'd administer the drug when Evelyn got home from the gala, make it look like she collapsed from a stroke. He'd be the one to discover her, call 911, pronounce her dead at the scene. Grant would play the devastated husband. They'd rush the burial, claim Evelyn had expressed wishes for a quick private ceremony. No autopsy, no questions. But you heard all this, Santos said. Why didn't you go to the police immediately? Caleb laughed bitterly. I tried. I went to the nearest precinct the next morning, told the desk sergeant I'd overheard a murder plot. He took one look at me, at my clothes, my beard, the way I smelled, and told me to sleep it off. Said if I came back making accusations without proof, He'd arrest me for making false reports. Santos winced. That shouldn't have happened. But it did. So I tried a different approach. I called Evelyn Hart's office, said I had urgent information about a threat to her life. Her assistant wouldn't put me through, said Mrs. Hart didn't take calls from strangers, and suggested I write a letter. Caleb's voice cracked slightly. I didn't have time to write letters. The gala was that night. So I did the only thing I could think of. I tracked down my old colleague, the one who helped me get the antidote synthesized. I figured if I couldn't stop them from dosing her, at least I could save her afterward. How did you know about the funeral? It was all over the news. Billionaire CEO Evelyn Hart dies suddenly at 51. They announced the funeral would be held the next day at Rosewood Memorial. Private ceremony, family only. Caleb met Santos's eyes. But I knew it wouldn't be private. They needed witnesses to make it look legitimate. And I knew I had one chance. Get there before they lowered her into the ground and gave her that second dose to finish the job. Santos was quiet for a moment, processing everything. Then she said, "The syringe Grant was holding when Evelyn woke up, you think that was the kill shot?" I know it was. The whole point of TTX is that it's temporary. The paralysis wears off after 12 to 24 hours if the dose isn't lethal. They needed her buried before she could wake up naturally, or they needed to give her something that would stop her heart for real. Caleb's jaw tightened. When I pulled those cotton plugs from her nose and gave her the antidote, I accelerated her recovery. Grant panicked. He couldn't let her wake up, couldn't let her tell everyone what he'd done. So he went for the syringe. "We have it," Santos said. "Our lab is running tests now. We'll know what was in it within a few hours." She closed her laptop. "Mr. Rains, you may have just saved a woman's life and uncovered what could be multiple homicides. That takes courage." "It takes desperation," Caleb corrected. "When you have nothing left to lose, courage is easy." Before Santos could respond, there was a knock on the door. Another detective stuck his head in. "Santos, you need to see this. Now." They left Caleb alone in the interrogation room. Through the window, he watched a cluster of detectives gather around a computer screen, their faces growing progressively more grim. Santos's hand went to her mouth. Someone swore loudly. And Caleb knew, with absolute certainty, that they'd found something terrible. When Santos returned 15 minutes later, she looked 10 years older. "We pulled Dr. Pierce's history," she said quietly. "In the past decade, he's been the attending physician for 11 deaths that were classified as natural causes. Strokes, heart attacks, sudden cardiac events. All of them were wealthy patients. All of them had spouses who inherited substantial estates, and all of them were buried within 24 to 48 hours of death." Caleb felt sick. 11 people. 11 that we can confirm so far. We're expanding the search. Santos sat down heavily. "Dr. Pierce has been in custody for 3 hours, and he hasn't said a word except to ask for his lawyer. But Grant Hart is talking. He's desperate to cut a deal, and he's giving us everything." "What's he saying?" "That it was all Dr. Pierce's idea. That the doctor approached him 6 months ago with the scheme, said he'd done it before and knew how to make it foolproof. That Grant was reluctant, but desperate because of his debts." Santos's expression hardened. "He's trying to paint himself as a victim of manipulation." "That's bullshit," Caleb said flatly. "I heard him under that bridge. He was eager. He was planning. This was his idea as much as Pierce's." "I believe you, but Grant has expensive lawyers and a media team already working to shape the narrative. They're going to argue temporary insanity, coercion, diminished capacity, anything to reduce the charges." Santos leaned forward. "That's why we need you to testify, Mr. Rains. Your testimony about what you heard under the bridge is crucial. Without it, Grant's lawyers will tear apart the circumstantial evidence." "I'll testify," Caleb said without hesitation. "But you know they're going to destroy me on the stand. They'll bring up my mental health history, my homelessness, make me look like an unreliable fantasist who made everything up for attention." "Let them try," Santos said grimly. "Because we have something they can't explain away. Evelyn Hart herself. She's awake now, fully conscious, and she's asking to see you." Caleb's breath caught. "She is?" "They moved her from the ER to a private room 2 hours ago. She's weak, still recovering from the drug, but she's lucid and angry and ready to tell us everything she remembers about the night Grant dosed her." Santos stood. "She wants to thank the man who saved her life. That's you, Mr. Rains." The drive to Mercy General Hospital took 20 minutes through rain-slicked streets. Santos drove while Caleb sat in the passenger seat, watching the city blur past through water-streaked windows. He felt disconnected from reality, like he was watching someone else's life unfold. Just 2 days ago, he'd been sleeping under a bridge. Now he was about to meet the woman he'd pulled back from death. The hospital lobby was packed with reporters held back by security. They shouted questions as Santos led Caleb through, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. "Mr. Rains, how did you know she was alive? Is it true you're homeless? What made you investigate Grant Hart?" Santos pushed through without answering, guiding Caleb to an elevator that required a key card to access. They rode up to the 8th floor in silence. When the doors opened, 2 uniformed officers stood guard outside a private room at the end of the hall. "She's expecting you," one of them said to Caleb. Santos stayed outside. "Take your time," she said. "I'll be right here." Caleb's hand trembled slightly as he pushed open the door. The room beyond was large and well-appointed, more like a hotel suite than a hospital room. Late afternoon light filtered through half-closed blinds, painting everything in shades of amber and gray. And in the bed, propped up on pillows with an IV line running into her arm, was Evelyn Hart. She looked nothing like the corpse he'd seen in the casket. Her skin had color now, warm and alive. Her eyes were clear, tracking his movement as he entered. She was still weak. He could see it in the way she held herself, the careful shallowness of her breathing, but she was undeniably, vibrantly alive. "Mr. Rains," she said. Her voice was hoarse, probably from the intubation, but steady. "Please, come in. Sit down." He moved to the chair beside her bed, suddenly aware of how he must look, his ragged coat, his unkempt beard, the smell of the streets that clung to him despite the rain. "Mrs. Hart, Evelyn," she interrupted. "Please call me Evelyn. I think we're past formalities, don't you?" A surprised laugh escaped him. "I suppose we are." She studied him with an intensity that made him want to look away. "The detectives told me what you did, that you heard Grant and Dr. Pierce planning under a bridge, that you tried to warn me, that when no one would listen, you came to my funeral and stopped my burial." Her eyes glistened. "You saved my life, Caleb. May I call you Caleb?" "Yes, of course." "Caleb," she repeated softly. "The doctors say I was less than 5 minutes from being lowered into the ground when you arrived. If you'd been any later, if you'd hesitated even once—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "But I wasn't late," Caleb said gently. "You're here. You're safe." "Am I?" Evelyn's laugh was bitter. "My husband tried to murder me. My doctor, a man I trusted for 7 years, poisoned me. I woke up in a casket, Caleb. Do you have any idea what that's like? Being unable to move, unable to breathe properly, hearing voices above you but unable to call for help?" A tear slid down her cheek. "I thought I was dead. I thought I was in hell." Caleb reached out instinctively, then stopped himself. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry you went through that. Don't apologize. You're the only person in this nightmare who has nothing to apologize for." She wiped her eyes impatiently. "I need to know what happened. The police have told me pieces, but I need to hear it from you. All of it. Please." So he told her everything. About sleeping under the Riverside Bridge, about the voices drifting down, about every word of the conversation he'd overheard. He told her about trying to warn her, about being dismissed, about making the desperate choice to synthesize an antidote and gamble everything on reaching her funeral in time. He left nothing out. Not his homelessness, not his mental health struggles, not the way the desk sergeant had laughed at him. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her face growing harder with each detail. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment, staring at her hands folded on the white hospital blanket. "I knew something was wrong," she finally said. "For months, I knew. Grant had been different, distracted, secretive, always on his phone at odd hours. Our finances were a mess, and every time I asked about it, he'd deflect or get angry. 3 weeks ago, I hired a private investigator to look into his activities." She laughed humorlessly. "The investigator's report was scheduled to arrive the day after the gala. I never got to read it." "The police will get it now," Caleb said. "It'll be evidence." "Evidence," Evelyn repeated. Such a clinical word for the destruction of my entire life. 22 years of marriage, Caleb. 22 years of building a life with someone, trusting them, loving them, and all of it was a lie. Not all of it, Caleb said quietly. The man you married might have been real once. People change. Circumstances change them. You're being generous to him. No, Caleb said. I'm being realistic about how far people can fall when they're desperate. I know something about that. He gestured to himself. 3 years ago, I was a software engineer pulling down $200,000 a year. I had a wife, a daughter, a house with a mortgage and a yard, and a golden retriever named Max. I thought I had it all figured out. Evelyn's expression softened. What happened? The company I worked for got bought out by a larger firm. Massive restructuring, half the staff laid off, me included. I told myself it would be fine. I'd find another job, I had savings, I was talented. But the tech sector was contracting. No one was hiring. The savings ran out. We lost the house. My wife, he swallowed hard. She left, took our daughter and moved in with her parents in Ohio, said she couldn't watch me fall apart anymore. I'm sorry, Evelyn said. Don't be. She was right. I was falling apart. Depression hit me like a freight train, and I didn't have the tools to fight it. Couldn't get out of bed, couldn't eat, couldn't see a future where things got better. I spent 6 months in a fog of therapy and medication that barely helped, and when the money ran out completely, I ended up on the streets. He met her eyes. So yes, I understand how circumstances can destroy a person. But Grant didn't fall, Evelyn. He chose. He chose to solve his problems by murdering you. You're right, she said after a moment. And I need to remember that. I need to stay angry because if I let myself feel anything else, if I let myself grieve what we had, I'll fall apart. And I can't afford that right now. Before Caleb could respond, there was a knock on the door. A nurse entered, followed by a woman in a sharp gray suit carrying a leather briefcase. The woman's eyes went immediately to Evelyn, and her professional composure cracked just slightly. Ms. Hart, she said, I'm Rebecca Chen, senior partner at Morrison & Associates. Your board of directors asked me to serve as your legal counsel moving forward. Evelyn nodded. Thank you for coming so quickly. Oh, of course. Rebecca's gaze shifted to Caleb, assessing. And you must be Caleb Rains. I've been briefed on your role in this situation. On behalf of the Hart Foundation and Mrs. Hart personally, I want to express our gratitude. I don't need gratitude, Caleb said. I need Evelyn to be safe. That's exactly why I'm here, Rebecca said crisply. She set her briefcase on the bedside table and pulled out a tablet. Mrs. Hart, we have a lot to discuss. Grant's legal team is already moving to freeze your assets, claiming you're mentally incapacitated from the trauma and therefore unable to make sound financial decisions. We need to file injunctions immediately. Evelyn's jaw tightened. He's still trying to steal from me, even now. His lawyers are arguing that the pre-burial administration of unknown substances by an unlicensed individual, Rebecca nodded toward Caleb, could have caused neurological damage. They're demanding a psychiatric evaluation before you're allowed to make any legal or financial decisions. That's insane, Caleb said. That's expensive lawyers earning their fees, Rebecca corrected, but we can fight it. I've already filed motions to maintain the status quo on all financial accounts and business decisions. The judge will hear arguments tomorrow morning. She turned back to Evelyn. I need you to be honest with me. How are you feeling? Any confusion, memory gaps, cognitive difficulties? I'm furious and exhausted and scared, Evelyn said, but my mind is perfectly clear, crystal clear actually. For the first time in months, I can see everything without the fog of trust blinding me. Rebecca smiled grimly. Good, because we're going to need that clarity. The district attorney is building a case against Grant and Dr. Pierce, but it's going to be complicated. Grant's team will argue he was coerced, manipulated, that he never actually administered the drug himself. But he tried to finish it, Caleb interjected. At the cemetery, when Evelyn started to wake up, he had that syringe. He was going to kill her right there in front of everyone. Which is attempted murder, absolutely, Rebecca agreed. But his lawyers will say he panicked, that he was in shock seeing his dead wife suddenly move. They'll paint it as a confused reaction, not premeditated intent. That's a lie, Evelyn said coldly. It's a defense strategy, Rebecca countered. And it might work if we can't prove premeditation. That's where your testimony comes in, Mr. Rains. What you overheard under the bridge is direct evidence of planning and intent. Caleb nodded slowly. Detective Santos already told me I'd need to testify. I'm ready. It won't be easy, Rebecca warned. Grant's lawyers will try to discredit you, your homelessness, your mental health history, anything they can use to make you seem unreliable. Let them, Caleb said quietly. The truth is the truth, regardless of who speaks it. The conversation continued for another hour, Rebecca outlining legal strategies while Evelyn asked sharp, incisive questions despite her obvious exhaustion. Caleb watched them work, these two women navigating the complex machinery of justice and finance, and felt oddly out of place. He'd done his part, saved a life, testified to what he'd heard. What role did he have in the battles to come? As if reading his thoughts, Evelyn turned to him suddenly. Caleb, where are you staying tonight? He blinked. I have a spot under the bridge. It's fine. It's absolutely not, Evelyn interrupted. Rebecca, arrange a hotel room for Mr. Rains, somewhere comfortable, somewhere safe, and put it on my personal account. Mrs. Hart, I can't, Caleb started. You can and you will, Evelyn said firmly. You saved my life, Caleb. The least I can do is give you a warm bed and a hot shower. Her expression softened. Please, let me do this. He wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain his independence, but the truth was he was bone-tired, and the thought of a real bed, a mattress, clean sheets, walls that blocked the wind, was almost overwhelming. Okay, he said quietly. Thank you. Rebecca made notes on her tablet. I'll arrange it. The Meridian downtown has excellent security. I'll have a car take you there within the hour. The nurse, who'd been waiting patiently throughout the conversation, finally stepped forward. Mrs. Hart needs to rest now. Doctor's orders. Rebecca gathered her things efficiently. I'll be back tomorrow morning before the hearing. Try to sleep, Evelyn. You're going to need your strength. Caleb stood to leave, but Evelyn caught his hand. Her grip was weak but determined. Thank you, she said, for everything. For being the one person who cared enough to act when everyone else turned away. You don't have to thank me, Caleb said. Just heal. Get strong, and don't let them win. I won't, Evelyn promised. Her eyes held a fierce determination that made Caleb believe her absolutely. They tried to bury me. Now I'm going to bury them. The hotel room at the Meridian felt like something from another lifetime. Caleb stood in the doorway for a full minute, just staring at the king-size bed with its pristine white duvet, the gleaming bathroom visible through an open door, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city lights below. The carpet was soft beneath his feet. The air smelled of lavender and clean linen instead of exhaust fumes and wet concrete. He set down the small bag the hotel had provided, toiletries, a change of clothes, basics he hadn't owned in over a year, and walked slowly to the window. 14 floors below, the city moved through its evening rhythms. Cars streamed past, their headlights painting ribbons of light through the rain. People hurried along sidewalks, their umbrellas bobbing like dark flowers. Somewhere down there was the bridge where he'd slept 2 nights ago, where he'd overheard the conversation that had led to this moment. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, gaunt, bearded, eyes shadowed with exhaustion that went deeper than lack of sleep. He barely recognized himself. The shower lasted 30 minutes. He stood under water so hot it turned his skin pink, watching 14 months of street grime spiral down the drain. He used the entire bottle of shampoo, scrubbing his hair and beard until his scalp tingled. When he finally emerged, wrapped in a towel that was softer than any blanket he'd owned, he found that housekeeping had quietly removed his old clothes and left the new ones folded on the bed. He dressed slowly, jeans that actually fit, a button-down shirt in dark blue, socks without holes, underwear that didn't itch. The man who looked back at him from the bathroom mirror was still gaunt, still tired, but cleaner. More human. His phone rang. He'd forgotten he even had it, a cheap prepaid model he'd bought months ago for emergency calls. The number was unknown. Mr. Rains? The voice was male, professional, unfamiliar. This is Marcus Webb. I'm a producer for Channel 7 News. I was hoping we could talk about what happened at the cemetery today. Caleb's hand tightened on the phone. How did you get this number? That's not important. What's important is that you have a story people need to hear. A hero story. The homeless man who saved a billionaire's life. America loves that narrative, Mr. Rains. We'd like to give you a platform to tell it. I'm not interested, Caleb said. We're prepared to offer compensation for an exclusive interview. $5,000 for 1 hour of your time. $5,000. Caleb thought about what that money could mean. First month's rent on an apartment, a security deposit, enough buffer to look for real work without the constant terror of where he'd sleep that night. But he also thought about Evelyn lying in that hospital bed, about the violation she'd endured, about how quickly a story like this could turn into a circus. No, he said, I'm not for sale. 10,000, Webb said, without missing a beat. And we'll present your story with dignity, I promise. You'd be helping others understand the homeless crisis, showing people that... Caleb hung up. The phone rang again immediately. He turned it off. There was a knock at the door. He opened it to find a hotel employee holding a tray laden with food, a burger, fries, a salad, a slice of chocolate cake, and a pot of coffee. Compliments of Mrs. Hart, the young woman said with a smile. Caleb's throat tightened. Thank you. He ate at the small desk by the window, forcing himself to go slowly, despite the fact that his stomach was cramping with hunger. Real food, hot and abundant. He'd forgotten what it felt like not to scavenge, not to calculate every calorie against the uncertainty of where the next meal would come from. Halfway through the burger, his turned-off phone buzzed with a text that must have been queued before he shut it down. He almost ignored it, but something made him check. It was from Detective Santos. Lab results back on the syringe. Potassium chloride would have stopped Evelyn's heart in seconds. Grant's lawyers are scrambling. Thought you'd want to know. Potassium chloride. Caleb had read about it during his years in pharmaceutical software development, a common drug used in medical settings, but in high doses, absolutely lethal. Injected directly into the bloodstream, it would cause cardiac arrest almost instantly. Grant had been seconds away from murdering his wife in front of 200 witnesses, banking on the chaos and shock to cover what he was doing. Another text came through, this one from an unknown number. Mr. Rains, this is Catherine Reeves from Hart Industries. I was at the funeral. I'd very much like to speak with you when you have time. Here's my direct number. Then another. Caleb Rains? This is Attorney James Morrison. I represent several parties interested in your testimony. Please call me ASAP. And another. Mr. Rains, CNN here. We'd like to discuss... He turned the phone completely off and shoved it in a drawer. Sleep should have come easily in that comfortable bed, but Caleb lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the moment Evelyn's eyes had opened in that casket. The terror in them, the confusion, and then, when she'd looked at Grant, the devastating clarity of betrayal. He thought about his own wife, ex-wife now, though the papers had never been formally filed. Sarah. She'd been an accountant, practical and steady, the ballast to his more erratic creative energy. When they'd met, he'd been 26 and convinced he was going to change the world with code. She'd laughed at his grandiose plans, but had loved him anyway, had married him in a small ceremony in her parents' backyard, had given birth to their daughter Emma in a hospital room where he'd held her hand and wept. The collapse had broken something between them that couldn't be repaired. He'd watched himself become someone she didn't recognize, withdrawn, angry, unable to meet her eyes because he saw his own failure reflected there. The day she'd packed Emma's things and left, Sarah had cried and told him she still loved him but couldn't save him if he wouldn't save himself. He hadn't spoken to either of them in 8 months. Didn't even know if Sarah had kept the same phone number. His daughter would be 9 now, almost 9.5. Did she remember him? Or had he become just a vague outline in her memory, the father who disappeared into his own depression and never came back? The ceiling offered no answers. Eventually, exhaustion won, and Caleb drifted into a fitful sleep haunted by images of caskets and syringes, and his daughter's face asking why he'd left. He woke to sunlight streaming through the windows and the jarring realization that he'd slept past dawn for the first time in months. The bedside clock read 8:30. He showered again, just because he could, and was finishing the complimentary breakfast that had been delivered when his phone rang. It was Detective Santos. Mr. Rains, I need you to come to the courthouse. The hearing for Grant's bail is this morning at 10, and the DA wants you there in case you need to testify. I thought this was just about freezing assets, Caleb said. It was, but Grant's lawyers filed an emergency motion claiming he's being held on insufficient evidence. They're arguing that everything that happened at the cemetery was a misunderstanding, that the syringe was actually medication he was trying to give his wife to help her, and that he's being railroaded by a disturbed homeless man with a vendetta. Santos's voice hardened. They're trying to get him released on bail before we can build the full case. We can't let that happen. The courthouse was a fortress of granite and glass in the heart of downtown. Media trucks lined the street outside, satellite dishes pointing skyward, reporters doing stand-ups with the building as their backdrop. Caleb arrived in an Uber, another courtesy of Evelyn's account, and had to push through a scrum of cameras and shouted questions to reach the security checkpoint. Inside, the halls echoed with footsteps and murmured conversations. Santos met him at the entrance to courtroom 4, her expression grim. Grant's team brought in Marcus Kellerman, she said. He's a defense attorney with a 90% acquittal rate and a reputation for destroying witnesses on the stand. If you testify today, he's going to come at you hard. I can handle it, Caleb said, with more confidence than he felt. I hope so, because Evelyn's entire future might depend on what happens in the next 2 hours. The courtroom was packed. Caleb found a seat in the back row, watching as the various players assembled. Grant sat at the defense table in a navy suit, looking every inch the respectable businessman. His hair was perfectly styled. His expression was one of dignified suffering. Next to him, Marcus Kellerman was a shark in a $1,000 suit, all sharp angles and predatory focus. The prosecution table held Assistant District Attorney Lauren Mitchell, a woman Caleb had seen on the news before, known for her aggressive prosecution of white-collar crime. She was setting up files with precise, economical movements. And then Evelyn entered through a side door, flanked by Rebecca Chen and 2 security guards. The courtroom went silent. She moved slowly, still weak from her ordeal, but her head was high and her gaze was steady. She wore a simple black dress and no jewelry except her wedding ring, which Caleb noticed she'd moved to her right hand. Grant stared at her. Evelyn didn't look at him once. All rise, the bailiff called. The Honorable Judge Patricia Okonkwo presiding. The judge was a black woman in her 60s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. She took her seat, surveyed the courtroom, and said, "Let's begin. Mr. Kellerman, I understand you filed an emergency motion regarding your client's bail status." Kellerman stood smoothly. "Yes, Your Honor. My client, Grant Hart, is being held without bail on charges that are entirely circumstantial and, frankly, fabricated. The prosecution's entire case rests on the unreliable testimony of a homeless man with documented mental health issues and the misinterpretation of my client's actions during an extremely traumatic event." "Your Honor," Ada Mitchell interrupted, "the defendant was caught on video attempting to inject his wife with potassium chloride, a lethal drug, moments after she regained consciousness in her own casket. That's not circumstantial. That's attempted murder captured by 200 cell phone cameras." "My client was in shock," Kellerman countered. "He believed his wife was dead. When she suddenly moved, he panicked and reached for what he thought was medication to help her. The fact that he had potassium chloride, a common medical supply, doesn't prove intent to murder. It proves he was trying to help." Judge Okonkwo's eyebrow rose. "He was trying to help her by injecting her with a drug that stops the heart?" "He was confused and traumatized, Your Honor, not thinking clearly. This is a grief-stricken husband being persecuted for having a breakdown at his wife's funeral." "His wife, who wasn't actually dead," the judge noted dryly. "Exactly," Kellerman said, as if this proved his point, "which suggests that the original death certificate was flawed, the burial was premature, and my client is a victim of medical malpractice, not a perpetrator of attempted murder." Ada Mitchell stood. "Your Honor, may I call a witness?" "Proceed." "The people call Caleb Raines." Caleb's heart hammered as he walked to the witness stand. Every eye in the courtroom followed him. This ragged man in borrowed clothes who'd upended a funeral and possibly saved a life. He was sworn in, his hand trembling slightly on the Bible, and took his seat. Mitchell approached with a kind smile. "Mr. Rains, can you tell the court how you came to be at Evelyn Hart's funeral yesterday? Caleb took a breath and recounted the story. The voices under the bridge, the overheard conversation, his failed attempts to warn anyone, his desperate decision to attend the funeral with an antidote. He spoke clearly, keeping his emotions in check, focusing on facts. When he finished, Kellerman stood for cross-examination. His smile was cold. Mr. Rains, he began, you're currently homeless, is that correct? Yes. And you've been homeless for approximately 14 months? Yes. During which time you've struggled with severe depression and anxiety, correct? I've had mental health challenges, yes. Challenges that resulted in your inability to maintain employment or housing? Caleb's jaw tightened. The job market collapsed. That resulted in my inability to maintain employment. But you did have a breakdown, didn't you? A mental collapse that your wife found so concerning she left you and took your daughter? The courtroom blurred slightly. Caleb forced himself to focus. My marriage ended, yes. That's not relevant to what I heard under the bridge. Isn't it? Kellerman moved closer. Mr. Rains, isn't it true that you've harbored resentment toward wealthy people since your financial collapse? That you blame the rich for your circumstances? No. No? You don't think it's convenient that you just happened to overhear this alleged plot? That you just happened to have access to a pharmaceutical antidote? That you just happened to arrive at the funeral at the perfect dramatic moment? I didn't happen to do anything, Caleb said, his voice steady despite the anger rising in his chest. I heard two men planning murder. I tried to stop it, and when no one would listen, I did what I had to do. Or, Kellerman suggested smoothly, you're a mentally unstable individual who became obsessed with a wealthy woman, fabricated an elaborate story, and injected her with an unknown substance that could have killed her, all for attention and a moment of feeling important again. That's not what happened. Then explain to me, Mr. Rains, how a homeless man living under a bridge managed to synthesize a pharmaceutical-grade antidote to a rare neurotoxin within 24 hours. I contacted a former colleague who had access to a university chemistry lab. I explained what I needed and why. He helped me. The name of this colleague? Caleb hesitated. He'd promised not to involve Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to Rebecca, in the legal mess to protect her position at the university. I'd rather not say. You'd rather not say, Kellerman repeated. How convenient. So we're supposed to believe this story based entirely on your word, the word of a man who admits to mental illness, who has no verifiable source for this antidote, who conveniently can't name his accomplice. She's not an accomplice. She's someone who believed me when no one else would. Or she doesn't exist at all, Kellerman said. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, this entire case is built on the fantasies of an unreliable witness. My client is innocent, and this witch hunt needs to end. ADA Mitchell stood quickly. Your Honor, we have corroborating evidence. The lab analysis of the syringe proves it contained lethal levels of potassium chloride. We have testimony from Dr. Pierce's former colleagues suggesting a pattern of suspicious deaths. We have financial records showing Grant Hart was drowning in debt and stood to inherit billions from his wife's death. This isn't fantasy, it's murder. Attempted murder at best, Kellerman corrected. And only if you ignore all reasonable explanations for my client's behavior. Judge Okonkwo held up a hand. Enough. She looked at Caleb. Mr. Rains, I have one question for you. When you heard this conversation under the bridge, did you have any doubt about what these men were planning? Caleb met her eyes. No, Your Honor, none at all. They were planning to murder Evelyn Hart, stage it as a natural death, and bury her before anyone could discover the truth. And when you saw Grant Hart with that syringe at the cemetery, he was going to finish what he started, kill his wife before she could wake up and expose him. The judge was quiet for a long moment, studying Caleb's face. Then she said, Mr. Rains, you may step down. She turned to the lawyers. I'm denying the motion for bail. Mr. Hart will remain in custody pending trial. Kellerman shot to his feet. Your Honor, that's my decision, Counselor. Your client is accused of attempted murder of his spouse. He has substantial financial resources and clear motive to flee. Bail is denied. She banged her gavel. We're adjourned. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed for the doors. Grant sat frozen at the defense table, his perfect composure finally cracking. And Evelyn, in the front row, closed her eyes and let out a breath she'd been holding since walking into the room. Caleb made his way toward the exit, desperate to escape the chaos, but Catherine Reeves intercepted him in the hallway. "Mr. Rains," she said, extending her hand. "We spoke briefly after the funeral. Catherine Reeves, CFO of Hart Industries." He shook her hand cautiously. "I remember. I won't keep you long. I know today was difficult, but I wanted to thank you personally for what you did. Evelyn is not just my boss, she's my friend. You saved her life." Catherine's eyes were fierce. "And I want to help you in return. I don't need—" "Yes, you do," Catherine interrupted gently. "You need a job, Mr. Rains. You need stability. And Hart Industries needs someone with your particular skills and moral courage." She handed him a business card. "We're hiring a director of ethics and compliance, someone to overhaul our internal systems and make sure nothing like what Grant did can happen again. The salary is $200,000, plus benefits. I'd like you to consider it." Caleb stared at the card. "You want to hire me? I've been living under a bridge." "You've been surviving impossible circumstances with your integrity intact," Catherine corrected. "That's exactly the kind of person we need." She smiled. "Think about it. Call me when you're ready to talk." She walked away, leaving Caleb standing in the courthouse hallway, holding a business card that might represent a way back to the life he'd lost, or a way forward to something new. Detective Santos found him a few minutes later. "That was good testimony," she said. "You held up well under Kellerman's attack." "He made me sound crazy," Caleb said. "He did his job, but the judge saw through it." Santos paused. "We arrested Dr. Pierce's lawyer this morning. Turns out he was trying to broker a deal where Pierce would testify against Grant in exchange for a reduced sentence. But while they were negotiating, we found evidence linking Pierce to 3 other suspicious deaths. Same pattern, same method. He's looking at multiple murder charges now." "How many people?" Caleb asked quietly. "We're still investigating, but it could be as many as 15 over the past 12 years. Santos shook her head. "You didn't just save Evelyn Hart, Mr. Rains. You exposed a serial killer." The weight of that settled over Caleb like a heavy coat. 15 people. 15 families destroyed. 15 lives stolen by a doctor who was supposed to heal. "Will they get justice?" he asked. "We're going to damn well try," Santos said, "and a lot of that depends on you staying strong." Grant's trial starts in 6 weeks. His lawyers are going to come at you with everything they have. They'll dig into every dark moment of your past, every mistake you've made, every symptom of your depression. They'll try to destroy your credibility. "Let them try," Caleb said. He thought about Evelyn's hand gripping his in the hospital, about her fierce determination not to let them win. "I've already lost everything once. They can't take anything from me that isn't already gone." "That's the spirit," Santos said. She hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, I think you're a hero. Not in spite of where you've been, but because of it. You know what it's like to be dismissed, ignored, treated as less than human, and you still chose to fight for someone else." Caleb didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired and scared and uncertain about everything except one thing. Evelyn Hart deserved justice, and he was going to make sure she got it. He left the courthouse through a side exit, avoiding the media circus at the front. The city stretched out before him, bright and loud and full of possibility. Somewhere in this sprawl, his ex-wife and daughter were living their lives. Somewhere, there was a bridge where he'd slept and a street corner where he'd stood with a cardboard sign asking for spare change. But also somewhere, in a hospital room growing stronger by the hour, was a woman he'd saved. And in his pocket was a business card that might lead to a future he'd stopped believing was possible. Caleb took a deep breath and started walking. The trial was coming, and he needed to be ready. The weeks before the trial moved with the strange duality of crawling and racing simultaneously. Caleb spent his days in a small apartment Catherine Reeves had arranged for him, temporary housing, while he considered her job offer, preparing testimony with ADA Mitchell, and trying to rebuild some semblance of normal life. The apartment was modest, just a studio in a building that had seen better decades, but it had a bed and a lock on the door and windows that looked out over a street where he could watch people live their ordinary lives. He'd called the number Catherine had given him on the 5th day after the bail hearing. She'd answered on the first ring, and within a week he was sitting in a conference room at Hart Industries, being interviewed by a panel of executives who treated him with a respect he hadn't experienced in years. They asked about his background in software engineering, his understanding of corporate ethics, his vision for creating systems that prevented abuse of power. "We need someone who understands how the powerful can exploit the vulnerable," Catherine had said as she walked him out after the interview. "Someone who won't be dazzled by money or intimidated by boardroom politics. Someone who's seen the worst of human nature and still chose to do the right thing." "I'm not sure I'm that person," Caleb had admitted. "You stood up at a funeral and called out a murder in progress," Catherine countered. "You risked arrest, public humiliation, and possibly your life to save someone you'd never met. If that's not moral courage, I don't know what is." The job offer came 2 days later, $200,000 a year, full benefits, a signing bonus that made Caleb's hand shake when he saw the number. He accepted it in a phone call that lasted less than 3 minutes, his voice cracking when he said yes. But the money and the apartment and the promise of stability couldn't quiet the nightmares. Most nights, Caleb woke gasping from dreams where he arrived at the cemetery too late, where Evelyn's casket was already being lowered into the ground, where dirt rained down on mahogany while he screamed and nobody heard. Other nights he dreamed of his daughter Emma, her face frozen at the age she'd been when Sarah left, asking him why he'd abandoned her. On a gray morning 2 weeks before the trial, Caleb did something he'd been avoiding since the day at the courthouse. He turned on his phone. He'd bought a new one with a proper plan and scrolled through his contacts until he found Sarah's number. His thumb hovered over the call button for a full minute before he pressed it. It rang 4 times. He was about to hang up when she answered. "Hello?" Her voice was exactly as he remembered, cautious, a little tired, fundamentally kind. "Sarah," he said. "It's Caleb." The silence on the other end stretched so long he thought she'd hung up. Then, "I know, your number's still in my phone." A pause. "I saw you on the news. The funeral, the woman you saved. Jesus, Caleb, are you okay?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'm better than I was. I have an apartment now, a job starting after the trial. I'm clean, sober, taking my medication." He swallowed hard. "I wanted you to hear it from me, that I'm getting back on my feet." "That's good," Sarah said softly. "I'm glad. I really am. How's Emma?" Another long pause. "She's good. Growing like a weed. She's in 4th grade now, doing well in school. She asks about you sometimes." Caleb's eyes burned. "What do you tell her?" "I tell her that you love her very much, but that you're sick and trying to get better. That someday, when you're ready, maybe you can see her again." Sarah's voice wavered. "Are you ready, Caleb?" He wanted to say yes. Wanted to demand to see his daughter immediately, to make up for the lost time, to prove he wasn't the broken man who'd let them both down. But he also knew that wanting wasn't enough. "Not yet," he said. "I need to get through this trial first. Need to make sure I'm stable, that I won't fall apart again. But Sarah, I want to be ready. I want to be in Emma's life again, if you'll let me." "We'll see," Sarah said, and it wasn't a rejection, just caution. "One step at a time, okay? Get through the trial, keep taking care of yourself, and then we'll talk about what comes next." "Thank you," Caleb whispered. "Take care of yourself, Caleb," Sarah said and hung up. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long time after, staring at the phone, feeling the weight of possibility and responsibility settling over him. He had a chance, a real chance to rebuild his life, to be a father again, to become someone his daughter could be proud of. But first he had to face Marcus Kellerman and a courtroom and the full force of Grant Hart's defense team trying to destroy him. The trial began on a Monday in November with temperatures dropping and the first hints of winter in the air. The courthouse was surrounded by media trucks and protesters, some holding signs supporting Evelyn, others defending Grant with messages about presumption of innocence and false accusations. Caleb arrived in a suit Catherine had insisted on buying him, feeling like an imposter in the crisp fabric and polished shoes. Inside, the courtroom was packed. The jury had been seated after 2 grueling weeks of selection, 7 women, 5 men, ranging in age from a 24-year-old grad student to a 70-year-old retired teacher. They watched the proceedings with expressions of fascinated horror as ADA Mitchell laid out the prosecution's case in her opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mitchell began, pacing before the jury box, "this case is about greed, betrayal, and attempted murder. The defendant, Grant Hart, conspired with Dr. Nolan Pierce to murder his wife, Evelyn, using a rare neurotoxin that mimics death. Their plan was simple: dose Evelyn with a drug that would make her appear dead, have Dr. Pierce sign a death certificate without running an autopsy, and bury her quickly before anyone could discover the truth. If not for the intervention of Caleb Raines, a man this defendant will try to discredit, Evelyn Hart would be dead, buried alive in a casket while her husband inherited $3 billion. Grant sat at the defense table looking appropriately somber, his hands folded, his expression one of wounded dignity. Kellerman had dressed him in a gray suit instead of his usual sharp tailoring, softening his appearance, making him look vulnerable instead of powerful. When it was Kellerman's turn, he stood slowly and addressed the jury with the confidence of someone who'd won this fight 100 times before. "The prosecution wants you to believe a fairy tale," he said. "They want you to believe that my client, a successful businessman with no criminal history, no history of violence, a man who's been married to Evelyn Hart for 22 years, suddenly decided to murder her in an elaborate plot worthy of a thriller novel. But here's what actually happened. Evelyn Hart suffered what appeared to be a massive stroke. Dr. Pierce, her trusted physician, pronounced her dead. Grant was devastated, planned a funeral, and was about to say goodbye to the love of his life when a disturbed homeless man crashed the service, injected Evelyn with an unknown substance, and caused her to have a reaction that everyone mistook for resurrection. Several jurors leaned forward, interested despite themselves. "The prosecution will bring you Caleb Raines," Kellerman continued, "and they'll paint him as a hero. But I ask you to look at the facts. Mr. Raines is mentally ill, homeless, desperate for relevance. He admits to injecting Evelyn with a substance he obtained through untraceable means. He admits to having no medical training, and he expects you to believe he saved her life, when the simplest explanation is that Evelyn wasn't actually dead, that Dr. Pierce made a medical error, and Mr. Raines simply woke her from a coma using a stimulant." Kellerman paused for effect. "My client isn't a murderer. He's a grieving husband who made a terrible mistake in a moment of shock and confusion, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is not a crime." The trial proceeded with the methodical precision of legal machinery. The prosecution called witness after witness: the paramedics who'd responded to the Hart mansion the night Evelyn collapsed, the funeral home director who described Grant's insistence on immediate burial, the lab technician who'd analyzed the contents of the syringe and found lethal levels of potassium chloride. Dr. Nolan Pierce was called to the stand on day 3. He'd aged 10 years in the past month, his face haggard, his hands trembling as he was sworn in. His lawyer had negotiated a plea deal, testimony against Grant in exchange for a reduced sentence on 1 count of attempted murder instead of 15 counts of actual murder. "Dr. Pierce," Ada Mitchell said, "how long have you known Grant Hart?" "About 8 years, Pierce said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And when did he first approach you about killing his wife?" 6 months ago, last May." Pierce wouldn't look at the jury. "He came to my office after hours, said he had a financial problem that could only be solved one way. He asked if I knew how to make a death look natural." "And what did you say?" "I told him I'd done it before." The courtroom gasped. Pierce closed his eyes. "I'd helped other clients, people trapped in marriages, people who needed insurance money, people who couldn't afford divorce. I'd administer the toxin, sign the death certificate, collect my fee. It was easy. Nobody questions a doctor." "How many times?" Mitchell asked quietly. 14. Pierce's voice broke. 14 times over 12 years. The jury looked horrified. One woman put her hand over her mouth. Grant stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. "And you agreed to help Grant Hart murder Evelyn?" "Yes. He paid me $50,000 up front, promised another $50,000 after she was buried. We planned it carefully. Wait until she was alone after a public event, dose her drink with the TTX, let her collapse at home where I could be the first responder. I'd pronounce her dead from a stroke, sign the paperwork, and Grant would arrange a quick funeral. Pierce finally looked up, his eyes red. We didn't count on someone overhearing us. We didn't count on Caleb Rains. Kellerman's cross-examination was brutal. He hammered Pierce on his plea deal, on his motivations for testifying, on his history of lying and manipulation. But the core facts remained unchanged. Pierce had admitted to serial murder, and Grant had paid him to add Evelyn to the list. On day 5, Evelyn took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as she was sworn in, every eye tracking her movement. She wore a navy dress and pearl earrings, her dark hair pulled back simply. She looked strong, but not invulnerable. A woman who'd survived hell and was willing to talk about it. Mrs. Hart, Mitchell began gently, can you tell the jury about the night of October 19th? Evelyn took a breath. I'd attended a charity gala at the Grand Hotel. Grant was supposed to come with me, but canceled at the last minute, said he had a business call. I went alone, came home around 11. Grant was waiting in the kitchen with a glass of wine. He said we should toast, that despite our problems, we were still partners. Did you drink the wine? Yes. It tasted slightly bitter, but I thought maybe the bottle had turned. Within minutes, I felt strange, dizzy, disconnected. I tried to stand and couldn't. My legs wouldn't work. Evelyn's voice remained steady, but her hands gripped the armrests of the witness chair. I asked Grant what was happening, and he just watched me. Didn't call for help, didn't move. He just watched me collapse. What's the next thing you remember? Waking up in darkness, complete darkness. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I could hear voices above me but couldn't respond. I was so cold. A tear slid down Evelyn's cheek. I thought I was dead. I thought this was death, being trapped in your body forever, aware but unable to do anything. And then I heard the minister's voice, and I realized where I was, in a casket, at my own funeral. Several jurors were crying now. Grant stared at the table in front of him. Did you know your husband had planned this? Mitchell asked. Not consciously, but looking back, there were signs. He'd taken out new life insurance policies on me, $5 million total. He'd been asking about my will, about the trust structure, about what would happen to my assets if I died. He'd grown distant, cold. I thought he was having an affair. Evelyn looked directly at Grant for the first time. I never imagined he was planning to murder me. When Kellerman stood for cross-examination, his usual sharpness was muted. Even he could see that attacking a woman who'd nearly been buried alive wasn't going to win jury sympathy. Mrs. Hart, he said carefully, you admit you didn't actually see Grant put anything in your wine. No, but I drank what he gave me, and within minutes I was paralyzed. Couldn't that have been a stroke, as Dr. Pierce initially believed? Dr. Pierce didn't believe anything, Evelyn said coldly. He was paid to lie. But you didn't know that at the time. You couldn't have known what was happening to you or why. I knew my husband was watching me collapse without helping. I knew he didn't call 911 until I was completely unconscious. I knew something was very, very wrong. Kellerman tried a few more questions but got nowhere. Evelyn was unshakable, her testimony devastating in its quiet certainty. Finally, on day 7, Caleb was called to testify. He walked to the stand on legs that felt like water, hyper-aware of the jury's eyes on him, of the media sketch artist capturing his face, of Grant Hart staring at him with undisguised hatred. A.D. Mitchell led him through his story again, the voices under the bridge, the overheard conversation, his failed attempts to warn people, his decision to attend the funeral with the antidote. Caleb spoke clearly, keeping his focus on the jury, trying to make them understand that despite everything about him that seemed unreliable, this truth was solid. Mr. Rains, Mitchell said, why should this jury believe you? Because I have nothing to gain from lying, Caleb said simply. I didn't know Evelyn Hart. I had no grudge against Grant Hart. I was a homeless man trying to sleep under a bridge when I overheard 2 men planning murder. I could have ignored it, rolled over and gone to sleep, but I couldn't live with myself if I did nothing and someone died. He looked at the jury. I'm not asking you to believe me because I'm credible or successful or put together. I'm asking you to believe me because what I'm telling you is true, and the evidence supports it. Then Kellerman stood, and the real battle began. Mr. Rains, you've admitted to suffering from severe depression. Is that correct? Yes. Depression that included paranoid thoughts, yes? I had anxiety about my future, but I wasn't paranoid. But you did have delusions, false beliefs disconnected from reality? No, Caleb said firmly. I was depressed, not delusional. Kellerman smiled thinly. Yet you expect this jury to believe that you, a homeless man with no resources, managed to obtain a rare pharmaceutical antidote and synthesize it in less than 24 hours? I had help from a colleague you refused to name. A colleague I'm protecting from being dragged into this circus, Caleb shot back. But yes, she exists. She'll testify if necessary. She? Kellerman pounced. This mysterious helper is a woman? Mr. Rains, isn't it true that you have a history of fixating on women you perceive as saviors? Your ex-wife, various social workers, and now this unnamed chemist and Evelyn Hart herself. That's not true, Caleb said, his temper rising. I don't fixate on anyone. I asked for help, and someone gave it to me. Or you made her up, just like you made up this entire story about overhearing a murder plot. Kellerman's voice was sharp now, cutting. Isn't the truth, Mr. Rains, that you became obsessed with Evelyn Hart, followed news about her, learned about her upcoming funeral, and concocted this elaborate scheme to inject yourself into her life and become important again? No. No? Then explain to me how a man living on the streets happened to be under the exact bridge where Grant Hart and Dr. Pierce were having this alleged conversation. It wasn't the exact bridge, Caleb said through gritted teeth. It was my bridge. I had been sleeping there for weeks. They chose it because they thought they were alone. They were wrong. Convenient, Kellerman sneered. Everything about your story is convenient, Mr. Rains. Conveniently overhearing a plot, conveniently having access to an antidote, conveniently arriving at the funeral at the perfect dramatic moment. This jury isn't stupid. They can see a fantasy when it's presented to them. It's not a fantasy, Caleb said, his voice rising. I heard what I heard. I did what I had to do. And if you can't accept that a homeless man might be telling the truth, that says more about your prejudices than my credibility. The courtroom went silent. Kellerman blinked, momentarily thrown. A.D. Mitchell was smiling slightly. No further questions, Kellerman said tightly. The trial continued for another week, forensic experts testifying about the tetrodotoxin found in Evelyn's blood, financial analysts detailing Grant's debts, character witnesses describing his increasing desperation in the months before the attack. The evidence piled up like stones building a wall, each piece supporting the next until the structure was undeniable. On the final day, closing arguments stretched for hours. Kellerman did his best, arguing reasonable doubt and medical errors and the unreliability of homeless witnesses. But A.D.A. Mitchell was devastating in her rebuttal. Grant Hart tried to murder his wife, she said, standing before the jury. He poisoned her, let her be declared dead, planned to bury her alive, and when she started to wake up, he tried to finish the job with a syringe full of potassium chloride. This isn't reasonable doubt. This is reasonable certainty. And the only reason Evelyn Hart is alive today is because one man had the courage to speak truth when everyone else turned away. She gestured to Caleb, sitting in the gallery. Mr. Kellerman wants you to dismiss Caleb Rains because he's homeless, because he struggled with depression, because he doesn't fit our image of what a hero looks like. But heroes rarely do. Sometimes they're broken men who've lost everything, who have every reason to stay silent and invisible, and who choose to act anyway. The defense wants you to believe Caleb Rains is crazy. I'm asking you to believe he's brave. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. Caleb spent that time in a waiting room with Detectives Santos and Catherine Reeves, drinking bad coffee and pacing until his legs ached. Evelyn was there too, silent and pale, Rebecca Chen at her side. When the bailiff finally came to tell them a verdict had been reached, Caleb's heart hammered so hard he thought he might pass out. They filed back into the courtroom, taking their seats as the jury entered. Caleb searched their faces for some hint of what was coming, but found nothing. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Okonkwo asked. The forewoman stood, the retired teacher, a woman with kind eyes and steel in her spine. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. The courtroom erupted. Grant's face went white. Kellerman was already standing, calling for motions. Evelyn closed her eyes and covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Catherine grabbed Caleb's arm, squeezing hard. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of solicitation of murder? Guilty. 3 guilty verdicts, one after another, each one a hammer blow to Grant Hart's carefully constructed defense. He sat frozen as the judge thanked the jury and set a sentencing date for 6 weeks later. As the courtroom emptied, Evelyn made her way to Caleb. Her eyes were red but clear, and when she reached him, she pulled him into a fierce hug that surprised them both. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you for believing what you heard. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for saving my life." Caleb hugged her back. This woman he'd pulled from a casket, this stranger who'd become central to his redemption. "You're welcome," he said. "You're safe now. It's over." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't quite true. The trial was over, yes, the guilty verdicts were in, but for both of them, the real work was just beginning. The work of healing, of rebuilding, of learning how to trust again after betrayal, the work of becoming whole. The sentencing hearing took place on a cold December morning when frost decorated the courthouse windows like lace. Caleb arrived early wearing the same suit he'd worn throughout the trial, now properly his own after Catherine had refused to take it back. The courtroom filled slowly, reporters, observers, and in the front row, Evelyn Hart flanked by Rebecca Chen and Catherine Reeves. Grant was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him. The transformation was complete. Gone was the polished businessman in designer suits. In his place sat a convicted felon who'd aged a decade in the months since his arrest. His expensive lawyers had filed appeals, motions for reduced sentencing, character testimonials from business associates who swore he'd been a good man once. None of it would matter much. Judge Okonkwo entered, and the room fell silent. She settled into her seat and reviewed the documents before her with the careful attention she'd given every aspect of this case. "Mr. Hart," she began, "you've been found guilty of attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation of murder. Before I impose sentence, do you have anything you'd like to say?" Grant stood slowly. For a long moment, he just stared at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "I know nothing I say will change what happens here today," he said. "I know I deserve punishment for what I did, but I want Evelyn to know—" He looked at her, and she met his gaze without flinching, "that I loved you once. That wasn't a lie. What I became, the choices I made, the darkness I fell into, none of that erases what we had in the beginning." "Don't," Evelyn said quietly, but with such force that everyone heard. "Don't you dare try to rewrite our history now. You didn't fall into darkness, Grant. You chose it. You chose money over my life. You looked me in the eye, poisoned me, and watched me collapse. Whatever we had died long before you tried to bury me." Grant's face crumpled. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." "It's worth nothing," Evelyn said. Judge Okonkwo let the silence settle before continuing. "Grant Hart, you plotted to murder your wife of 22 years for financial gain. You enlisted a doctor who turned out to be a serial killer. You very nearly succeeded in one of the most heinous crimes I've encountered in my 30 years on the bench. The only reason Evelyn Hart is alive today is because of the intervention of a witness you and your attorneys spent weeks trying to discredit." The judge looked at Caleb, who sat very still in the gallery. "Mr. Raines showed this court what moral courage looks like," she continued. "He risked everything, his safety, his credibility, his privacy, to save a stranger's life. Meanwhile, you, Mr. Hart, with every advantage society could offer, chose murder." She paused. "On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, I sentence you to 25 years to life. On conspiracy to commit murder, 15 years concurrent. On solicitation, 10 years concurrent. You'll be eligible for parole in 25 years, at which time you'll be 67 years old. Perhaps by then, you'll have developed the conscience you so clearly lacked." Grant swayed slightly, but didn't fall. The bailiffs moved to escort him out, and as he passed Evelyn's row, he stopped. "I hope you find happiness," he said to her. "I really do." Evelyn didn't respond. She watched him disappear through the side door with an expression Caleb couldn't quite read. Not triumph, not relief, just a kind of exhausted finality. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, but Evelyn's security team carved a path to the waiting car. Caleb hung back, not part of that world, but Evelyn turned and called to him. "Caleb, wait." He approached cautiously. The December wind cut through his coat, and he shoved his hands in his pockets. "Walk with me," Evelyn said. "Just for a minute." They moved away from the crowd, down a side path that led to a small park adjacent to the courthouse. Bare trees stretched skeletal branches against a gray sky. A few pigeons pecked at the frozen ground, hopeful for crumbs. "How are you?" Evelyn asked. "I should be asking you that," Caleb said. "You're the one who just watched your husband get sentenced to 25 years. Ex-husband. The divorce was finalized last week." Evelyn pulled her coat tighter. "And I don't know what I am. Not happy. Not sad exactly. Just ready to move forward." She glanced at him. "Catherine tells me you start at Hart Industries next week." "I do. Director of Ethics and Compliance. Still can't quite believe it's real." "Believe it. You earned it." Evelyn stopped walking and turned to face him fully. "Caleb, I need to tell you something. When I woke up in that hospital, when the doctors told me what had happened, my first thought wasn't about Grant or the betrayal. It was about you. This stranger who'd heard something terrible and refused to look away. I kept thinking about what courage that took. Real courage. Not the boardroom kind where the risks are calculated and the safety nets are in place. The kind where you risk everything because it's right." "I just did what anyone would do," Caleb said. "No," Evelyn said firmly. "Most people would have convinced themselves they misheard, would have told themselves it wasn't their problem, would have prioritized their own safety over a stranger's life. You didn't. And I want you to know that changed something in me. Made me realize how insulated I'd become, how many things I'd stopped seeing because they were uncomfortable or inconvenient." She smiled slightly. "You saved my life, yes. But you also reminded me what kind of person I want to be." "You're giving me too much credit," Caleb said, uncomfortable with the weight of her gratitude. "I'm really not." Evelyn reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. "I wanted to give you this in person. It's not payment. You can't pay someone for saving your life. Think of it as a foundation, a starting place." Caleb opened the envelope. Inside was a check for $100,000. "Evelyn, I can't—" "You can and you will," she interrupted, echoing Catherine's words from weeks ago. "Use it to get fully back on your feet. Rent a real apartment, buy a car if you want one, save it for your daughter's college fund, whatever you need. Please don't argue with me on this." Caleb stared at the check, his vision blurring. "This is too much." "It's not even close to enough," Evelyn said gently. "But it's what I can offer right now. Take it. Build the life you deserve." He folded the check carefully and put it in his pocket, his throat too tight for words. They walked in silence for a few more minutes before Evelyn's phone buzzed with a message from Rebecca saying the car was ready. "I have meetings," Evelyn said. "Restructuring the board, implementing new oversight systems, all the unglamorous work of making sure this never happens again." She held out her hand. "Thank you, Caleb, for everything." He shook her hand and then, on impulse, pulled her into a brief hug. "Take care of yourself," he said. "You deserve happiness too." "Working on it," Evelyn said with a small smile. "One day at a time." He watched her walk back toward the courthouse, her security team closing around her like a protective shell, and felt the strange, bittersweet weight of closure. Their lives had intersected at a moment of crisis, had become entangled in ways neither could have predicted, and now they were diverging again, both moving forward but on separate paths. The job at Hart Industries started the following Monday. Caleb arrived at the gleaming downtown headquarters at 8 in the morning, still not quite believing he belonged in a building with marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows. Catherine met him in the lobby and rode up with him to the 14th floor, where his new office waited. "It's not huge," she said, opening the door, "but it's yours." The office had a desk, a computer, a view of the city, and a door that closed, more than Caleb had dared hope for. On the desk was a welcome packet and a note from Evelyn that read simply, "Thank you for reminding us what integrity looks like. Use it to hold us accountable." The first weeks were overwhelming. Caleb met with department heads, reviewed existing ethics policies, identified gaps in oversight systems. He discovered that grants embezzlement had been possible because of a culture that prioritized loyalty over accountability, where questioning senior executives was seen as disloyalty. His job was to dismantle that culture and build something better. He worked long hours, fueled by coffee and a determination not to waste this second chance. But he also made time for therapy, real therapy with a psychiatrist who specialized in trauma and depression. He took his medication consistently. He joined a support group for people rebuilding after homelessness. And slowly, carefully, he began to feel like himself again. Not the self he'd been before the collapse, but someone new. Someone who'd been broken and had learned how to heal. 3 months into the job, his phone rang with a number he recognized immediately. "Sarah." "Caleb," she said. "Emma wants to see you." His heart stopped. "Really? Really? She saw you on the news, saw the articles about the trial. She asked me if you were the daddy who went away, and I told her yes. And she asked if you were better now." Sarah's voice was gentle. "I think you are. So if you're ready, we'd like to come visit. Maybe lunch somewhere neutral?" "Yes," Caleb said immediately. "Yes, absolutely. Whenever you want." They met on a Saturday at a diner halfway between their two cities. Caleb arrived early, so nervous he could barely sit still. When Sarah and Emma walked through the door, time seemed to fold in on itself. Emma was taller, her face had lost some of its baby roundness, but she had the same dark curls and serious eyes he remembered. "Hi, Daddy," she said shyly. Caleb knelt down to her level, his eyes burning. "Hi, sweetheart. I missed you so much." Emma studied him seriously. "Mommy says you were sick, but you're getting better." "That's right," Caleb said. "I'm much better now, and I'm so sorry I was gone for so long." She thought about this. "It's okay. Grandma says sometimes people need time to heal." "Your grandma is very wise," Caleb said, his voice cracking. They had lunch together, burgers and fries and milkshakes that Emma insisted on chocolate, even though Sarah said she'd had too much sugar already. They talked about school, about Emma's friends, about the hamster she'd gotten for her birthday. Caleb showed her pictures of his office, told her about his job, about the woman he'd saved. "You're a hero," Emma said matter-of-factly. "I'm just a dad who's trying to do better," Caleb replied. When it was time to leave, Emma hugged him tightly. "Can we do this again?" she asked. "Anytime you want," Caleb promised. Sarah lingered after Emma went to wait in the car. "You look good, Caleb. Healthy, stable." "I'm trying," he said. "Every day I'm trying." "I can see that." She hesitated. "I'm not ready to talk about us, about what we were or might be again. But I'm ready to co-parent, to let you be part of Emma's life again, if you can stay consistent." "I will," Caleb said. "I swear I will." "Then let's start there," Sarah said, "one step at a time." Over the following months, those visits became regular. Every other weekend, Caleb would make the drive to see Emma. Sometimes they'd go to the park or the movies. Sometimes they'd just hang out at Sarah's parents' house, playing board games or helping Emma with homework. Slowly, trust rebuilt. Emma started calling him more often, sharing little victories and frustrations. Sarah began to relax, to believe that this version of Caleb, steadier, more self-aware, might actually last. At work, Caleb's reforms were taking hold. He'd implemented anonymous reporting systems, mandatory ethics training for executives, and regular audits of financial decisions. Several board members had resigned rather than accept the new oversight. "Good riddance," Evelyn had said when she heard. Evelyn herself had changed too. She was more cautious now, slower to trust, but also more purposeful. She'd restructured the foundation to focus on homelessness initiatives, had personally funded a shelter that employed formerly homeless individuals in peer counseling roles. When the shelter opened, she'd asked Caleb to speak at the ribbon cutting. "Tell them your story," she'd said. "Let them know that recovery is possible." He'd stood before a crowd of donors and politicians and people currently living on the streets, and he'd told them the truth about his collapse, his time under the bridge, the night he'd overheard a murder plot and made the choice to act, about how one decision, one moment of courage, had led to a chain of events that gave him his life back. "I'm not special," he'd said. "I'm just someone who hit bottom and found a reason to climb back up. And if I can do it, anyone can. But not alone. Never alone. We need systems that support recovery, that offer second chances, that see people as people, no matter where they sleep at night." The applause had been thunderous, and afterward 3 people from the shelter had approached him, asking if Hart Industries was hiring. He'd gotten 2 of them jobs within the week. 2 years after the trial, Caleb attended another ceremony, this one at a maximum security prison 3 hours north of the city. Dr. Nolan Pierce was being sentenced for 15 counts of murder after investigators had uncovered the full scope of his crimes. Families of the victims filled the courtroom, their faces etched with grief and rage. Caleb watched as Pierce was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. The doctor wept throughout, his earlier cooperation forgotten in the weight of his crimes. This time, there was no redemption, no reduction in sentence, just justice, cold and absolute. Outside afterward, Caleb met with 3 of the victims' families. They thanked him for exposing Pierce, for stopping him before he could kill again. One woman, whose husband had been Pierce's 5th victim, gripped Caleb's hands and said, "You gave me answers. You gave me closure. That's more than I ever thought I'd have." That night, Caleb drove home to the apartment he'd rented, a real 1-bedroom with a kitchen and a living room and space for Emma to visit. He made dinner, called his daughter to say goodnight, and sat on his small balcony watching the city lights. His phone buzzed with a text from Evelyn. "Saw the news about Pierce's sentencing. Justice served. Hope you're doing okay." He texted back, "I'm good, really good. Hope you are too." Her reply came quickly, "Getting there. One day at a time." Caleb smiled and set down the phone. One day at a time. That had become his mantra, his anchor. He couldn't control the future, couldn't guarantee he'd never struggle again. But he could show up. He could do the work. He could be present for his daughter, and honest in his job and grateful for the second chance he'd been given. 5 years after saving Evelyn's life, Caleb stood in a different kind of ceremony. Emma, now 14 and brilliant and kind, had just won a regional science fair with a project on sustainable water purification systems. Sarah beamed from the audience as Emma accepted her trophy, and when she thanked my dad, who taught me that helping people matters more than anything, Caleb's eyes filled with tears. After the ceremony, Emma ran to hug him. "Did you see? Did you see?" "I saw," Caleb said, holding her tight. "I'm so proud of you." "You're coming to dinner with us, right?" Emma asked. "Mom's making lasagna." Caleb glanced at Sarah, who nodded with a small smile. "Wouldn't miss it," he said. They weren't back together, might never be, but they'd found a new configuration, a different kind of family built on honesty and forgiveness and the shared love of their daughter. It was enough, more than enough. At work, Caleb had been promoted to Chief Ethics Officer, overseeing compliance across all of Hart Industries' divisions. Under his watch, the company had become an industry leader in transparency and accountability. Evelyn, now remarried to a quiet architect named Michael, who had no interest in her fortune and every interest in her happiness, had expanded the foundation's reach to 12 cities. They still met occasionally, quarterly lunch meetings where they'd discuss foundation initiatives and industry trends. The relationship had evolved from savior and save to colleagues, then friends. The trauma that had brought them together had receded into the past, leaving behind mutual respect and genuine affection. On the 10th anniversary of the day Caleb had stopped Evelyn's burial, the local news ran a retrospective. They interviewed both of them separately, asking what they'd learned. "I learned that the people society dismisses often see the truth most clearly," Evelyn said to the camera. "That wealth and status don't make someone worthy, and poverty doesn't make someone worthless. I learned to look beyond surfaces, to trust my instincts, and to never, ever take my life for granted." In his own interview, Caleb said, "I learned that hitting bottom isn't the end of your story. It can be the beginning of a better one. That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. And that sometimes the smallest choices, to speak up, to intervene, to care about a stranger, can change everything." The interviewer asked if he'd do it again, rush into that cemetery, risk everything to save someone he'd never met. Caleb didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. Without question." That evening, Caleb met Emma and Sarah at a restaurant to celebrate Emma's acceptance to MIT's early admission program. She wanted to study engineering, following, in her own way, the path her father had once walked. But she'd do it with his support this time, with his guidance and encouragement and presence. As they ordered dinner and Emma chattered excitedly about campus life and research opportunities, Caleb felt a profound sense of peace. His life hadn't turned out the way he'd once imagined. He'd lost years to depression and homelessness, had endured humiliation and despair, had been tested in ways that had nearly destroyed him. But he'd survived. More than survived. He'd grown. He'd become someone who understood suffering and could sit with others in their pain without flinching. Someone who knew the value of a second chance because he'd been given one. Someone who'd looked into darkness and chosen again and again to turn toward the light. Years later, when Caleb was 53 and Emma had her own daughter, he'd tell his granddaughter about the night under the bridge, about the funeral, about the woman in the casket who'd coughed back to life. He'd tell her about the trial and the conviction and the years of rebuilding that followed. And his granddaughter would ask, "Were you scared, Grandpa, when you ran into that cemetery?" Caleb would think for a moment, remembering the pounding of his heart, the chaos, the certainty that he might be arrested or worse. Terrified, he'd admit. But sometimes being scared and doing it anyway is the only kind of brave there is. But that was still to come. For now, Caleb sat in a restaurant with his daughter and his ex-wife, who'd become his friend, celebrating a future that once seemed impossible. His phone buzzed with a message from Evelyn, a photo of her and Michael on a beach somewhere tropical, both of them sun-bronzed and genuinely happy. The caption read, "Life after death is pretty amazing. Thank you for making it possible." Caleb texted back a simple heart emoji and slipped his phone away. Around him, the restaurant hummed with life, laughter, and conversation, and the clatter of dishes, all the beautiful noise of people living their ordinary, extraordinary lives. He'd been on the outside of that for so long, nose pressed to the glass, watching a world he couldn't access. Now he was inside. Warm, fed, loved, useful, alive in every sense of the word. Emma reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Love you, Dad." "Love you too, sweetheart," Caleb said. "More than you'll ever know." And in that moment, surrounded by the people who mattered most, Caleb understood something profound. The day he'd saved Evelyn Hart from her grave, he'd saved himself too. 2 lives pulled back from darkness. 2 futures reclaimed. 2 people who'd looked death in the face and chosen, against all odds, to live. The story that began with 3 words shouted across a cemetery, "She's not dead," had become a story about resurrection of a different kind. Not the impossible miracle of returning from actual death, but the possible miracle of returning from despair, of finding purpose in pain, of being broken and becoming whole again, of being seen, believed, and given the chance to matter. That, Caleb thought as he raised his glass to toast his daughter's future, was the real miracle. Not the dramatic rescue, or the courtroom victory, or even the justice served. But this ordinary Tuesday night in a crowded restaurant, celebrating with people he loved, knowing he'd be here tomorrow and the day after that. Knowing he'd fought for this life and earned it, and would never, ever take it for granted again. The trial was over, the verdicts were in, the sentences served, but the story, the real story, was just beginning, for both of them, for all of them. And it was, despite everything, a story of hope.